you share your thoughts on how you think quilts can be used?
Obviously, they can be very joyful on beds and as bed warmers. They can give a message, and they can inform people. There are certainly political quilts that can make you stop and think. I've seen a lot of those in more recent years.
For the country, it's very important because it was a lifesaver for early America, for families moving across country, for pioneers, for slaves on plantations, that kept them warm in the wintertime. And so it has a very special place in American history as well as in international history.
I think that the artists I've spoken with, and I know with myself, this is the best way, just like a photographer take pictures to remember history or to record history, or a writer might write to record history. Our artists, we draw, we quilt, or we paint to record our history.
As I made the first quilt, I prayed that he would be elected to the presidency. I didn't have to pray as much for the second quilt. I had to pray that I finished it in time because I was doing it all by hand. So my prayer was a little bit different.
This is Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast. I'm your host, Janneken Smucker. American quilts are intricately tied to race. The 19th century explosion in quilt making was only possible because of the abundance of inexpensive printed cotton, which in turn was only possible because of the institution of slavery. While only a few well-documented quilts made by enslaved individuals exist today, research from various sources, including from the Works Progress Administration's slave narratives conducted in the 1930s, makes clear that many enslaved people made quilts. African American quilt makers have continued to create a prolific and diverse body of quilts, including many that reflect and share the stories of African American oppression and fights for civil rights. I spoke with this episode's guest, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, on June 2, a week after the killing of George Floyd, while protests were heated in cities and towns throughout the country. I plan to talk with her about the legacy of the Journey of Hope Quilts Inspired by President Barack Obama exhibit that she curated in 2008, and several other landmark exhibits she had organized centered on civil rights and social justice. I feel so fortunate to have spoken with someone who had lived through so much of civil rights history during that particular week, when helicopters were circling overhead in my Philadelphia neighborhood and the local police had fired tear gas on protesters nearby. Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi is the Bess Lomax National Endowment for the Arts National Heritage Fellow. She's the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network, and the curator of numerous exhibitions, including And Still We Rise, Race, Culture, and Visual Conversation, and Journey of Hope, Quilts Inspired by President Barack Obama. Her most recent book, among many, is We Who Believe in Freedom. Karen Musgrave interviewed Dr. Mazloomi in 2009 as part of the Quilters SOS Save Our Stories subproject on the Obama Quilt exhibit. These interviews, as well as all interviews in the QSOS collection, are archived with our partner, the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. Karen asked her about the quilt she made for that show, the Obama show, called He Stands on the Shoulders of Many.
Well, that quilt was inspired by the Selma to Montgomery march that occurred in 1965. When I think about being a citizen in this country, I think about the right to vote, because that's one of the greatest treasures of being an American, that freedom and that right to vote. And it was because of the Selma to Montgomery Civil Rights March that there was legislation that got African Americans the right to vote. That Selma to Montgomery march for voting rights lasted 3 weeks, and one of the turning points of that march was on what we call Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday occurred March 7th, 1965, when there were 600 civil rights marchers that headed out east of Selma, Alabama on U.S. Route 80, and they only got 6 blocks. And there was a bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and when they approached that bridge to cross the bridge, the state and local lawmen attacked the marchers with billy clubs and tear gas, and it was the first time America, a nation, got an opportunity to see really what was going on with the civil rights workers, and people were horrified that these marchers were beaten down like they were. So that was the catalyst for this Voting Rights Act. So that was the inspiration for my quilt, because when I talk about the president standing on the shoulders of many, it took the sacrifice of many African Americans, not only during this period in our history, but from slavery until this period in our history. Very seldom now I have the opportunity to make quilts because I'm so busy doing other things. However, it was important to me to participate in this particular exhibition because of the occasion.
I'm so happy to have a chance to have this conversation with you, despite it being a really challenging time in our world, in our nation. It's June 2nd, 2020, and we've had a really heavy, challenging week among many, many months of heartache here. So
Yes.
how are you doing, Dr. Mazloomi, during these
Well, it's a very difficult period of time for me as a person. I'm 75, grew up in the South during the civil rights era, in segregation. So this era and time right now in our history brings back horrible memories from the 40s and 50s during that time of segregation here in the United States, and much, much turmoil. And I find it frightening. It's a terrible regression. I feel we've regressed 80 years. I feel the progress that we've made is slowly fading.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Let's listen back to Carolyn's 2009 interview recalling the impetus for the Obama Quilt exhibition.
So one of the things, too, that I asked the artist when making these quilts, I told them that this is not just about the physical image of President Obama. I didn't want to see 44 quilts that are portraits of the president, because this exhibition that they were for was about more than the image of one man. Actually, it was about the journey of African Americans. as they weave their way through the social and political politics of this country. It's about the journey. It was about the journey of African Americans in this country, from the slave ship to the White House.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Obama Quilt exhibit?
I wanted to create an exhibition to celebrate the fact that America elected its first African American president. I'm the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network, and it was important to me and well as the members of the network to celebrate this momentous occasion, because it was something that we thought we'd never see, not in our lifetimes. The membership of the network is 72 to 102. So we remember, we are men and women from the segregated era in this country. So we were elated to see Mr. Obama elected president. I felt there should be an exhibition to commemorate this election. So I notified the network members that we were going to do a show, and the show was beautiful, but it caused a lot of problems at the same time. I got a lot of hate mail about this show, a lot of pushback about the show. People that didn't like President Obama could not separate the fact that the show was not about partisan politics. What I was trying to do was celebrate how a Black man, per se, got from a slave ship to the White House. Mr. Obama stood on many shoulders over a 400-year history, okay, to get to the point that an African-American man could be president. So it was about celebrating the people on whose shoulders he stood on to get to where he got. Even booking the show was horrible. I thought it would be booked in New Orleans at the New Orleans African American Museum. But some city officials told the museum authorities if they take the show, the city would cut their funding. Then the show was supposed to go to Brown versus Board of Education Gallery, and they advertised the exhibition on the internet, and some members from the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, called the center and threatened to burn it down if they have the show. So that show was canceled. Even in Chicago, I had a difficult time finding a venue in Chicago, even though it was President Obama's hometown. It was just incredible. Even some of the newspapers in Chicago weren't favorable about the show. So as I said, I got a lot of bad emails and letters from people who just hated President Obama and did not like the idea that there was a show celebrating this president. So whereas it gave us pride, the makers, it was quite troublesome as well. And it was very interesting. The show traveled to Europe and Japan, and it was so well received. Then it came here, and it was difficult.
Much of Carolyn's work has been with the Women of Color Quilters Network. Let's listen to an excerpt from Peggy Hartwell's 2009 QSOS interview, where she describes first meeting Carolyn and the foundation of the network.
I met Dr. Mazloomi, so long ago.
I can't even remember how long ago. It might have been in the 80s, but she had a letter in Quilters magazine, and myself and about, I think, 8 other people answered her. She was looking for other African-American quilters that she wanted to connect with. So myself and, like I said, 8 other people connected with her, and that was the beginning of the Women of Color Quilters Network. And it was so amazing that we all didn't meet each other until, like, say, like a year or 2 later. But when we did, we were like long-lost friends. We were able to share with each other through quilts techniques and family and hopes and dreams. It was just a wonderful experience to know her and the women that she collected through this one letter that she placed in Quilters newsletter.
Why do you think quilts, in particular, are such good vehicles for expressing ideas and stories and emotions?
I feel everybody can relate to quilts because we as human beings have a lifelong relationship with cloth. This is the first thing we're swathed in from birth and the last thing to touch our bodies upon our death. And people find it very comforting, cloth. And it's a soft place to land when you have to tell a story. It's much more palatable to have a story sewn into the cloth of a quilt. And all of my quilts are story quilts, narrative quilts. 99% of the people that are in the Women of Color Quilters Network make narrative quilts. Story quilts are very important to us. I like to think of the network members and myself as fabric griots. We're the people that are telling the story of our culture, and that's important. I always say, and I've heard many historians say, that quilts are like cultural documents. Indeed, for me, they are, because they tell our story of the story of our existence here in the United States, and every story that surrounds that, whether it be our families, our spirituality, the politics of the day. We find all of those subject matters within the threads of a quilt.
What can we learn from quilts, whether they're contemporary quilts made by artists or historic ones that were made for utility or for leisure around the home? What can we learn from quilts?
Well, a lot of things. First off, we learn a lot about women, okay? And every quilt I make is about either the status of women or some facet of African American history. Not to say that men aren't involved in quilt making, they are, but it's important to see the creativity that comes from women and the creativity that comes from makers. I believe that every human being has the capacity to be an artist or maker. And I think that creativity feeds our spirit and it's good for our mental well-being. So quilts add to that. And then for me as storyteller, quilts are important because they are an intricate part of our history. These are the pieces that are going to be left and studied by scholars 100 years from now. And they can get a glimpse not only into the quilt maker's life, but what was happening around that quilt maker during the time that she made that quilt. So the stories in the quilt are very intricate and important, and that history is a part of our nation's heritage.
So we've had quite the last few months here. I wanted to ask what how you've been using quilts. And I often ask the question in QSOS interviews, how have you used quilt making to get through a difficult time? And I wanted to hear what you were doing during this pandemic. I know the Women of Color Quilters Network has been quite active. And we can extend that conversation also to these really discouraging current events of the last week or so as well. So how are you using quilts, whether as a maker or as someone who thinks deeply about these objects during this difficult time? And please extend that beyond quilts, because I know mask making is such a vital part of what people have been doing here as well.
Right now, the Women of Color Quilters Network has been very busy making masks for PPEs, churches, and funeral homes around the country. Collectively, we've made over 23,000 masks within the last 8 weeks. And I'm very proud of that. And it's very important to us because in this pandemic, African Americans have been disproportionately affected more than any other segment of the population. Even though we're only 13% of the population, we are almost 70% in some regions of the deaths of this pandemic. So for us, it's like, what do we do? What can we do to help? And it's a very humbling thing to make a simple mask that can help possibly prevent people from getting this virus. We have people like Dorothy Burge, who's a member from Chicago, who took it upon herself to educate young African Americans about wearing masks because they didn't want to wear masks. So she specifically made masks for the youth in her community and gave them to them and encouraged them to wear them and set about educating them as to why it's important that they should wear them. So we made the mask, and we have some artists that started making art masks. In fact, I did a contest for mask makers, and I thought it would be a nice respite for the network members because they've been making these masks, utility masks, for so long. Okay, let's have a little fun. Some of the network members said, well, why don't you make it public? I had no idea. I got entries from around the world.
Wow.
It was amazing. I was shocked. So that was very interesting.
Carolyn reflected on the killing of George Floyd and what the community of quilters might do in response.
Over the last week, there was the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. And as a mother of 2 Black sons, it was very traumatizing for me. It's always difficult to see any human being lose their life. But for me, it was particularly difficult to see this young African American man slowly killed and actually tortured. And for me, too, since a lot of the work I create has to do with the status of women, it was quite meaningful for me and significant that you hear the last words from Mr. Floyd's mouth. where he called for his mother. And I would imagine, I was thinking, well, the mother must still be alive, but I found out later that she had passed. He knew he was dying. And I thought, how significant is that? When you talk about the status of women and the importance of women in the entire universe of humanity, you know, simple things like the first words out of a baby's mouth usually is mama. Some of the last words uttered from us as human beings, like Mr. Floyd, we call upon our mothers, who are first teachers of all humanity, because they give birth, they give us life. For that reason, I told the network members, okay, we have to celebrate Mr. Floyd's life, not only his life, but all lives that have been killed through police brutality. So I suggested, since I'm on the board of the Textile Center, that we get every gallery, every museum space, and we fill it with exhibitions. We fill it with exhibitions to commemorate the dead due to police brutality. We commemorate, we put quilts in there in places to teach people about African American history and the contributions African Americans have made to make this country as great as it is, because we have always been present. We have a 400 years of history here in this country, and we have made great contributions in all strata of life here in this country. I have another exhibition, We Who Believe in Freedom, that chronicles the civil rights era, how we struggled. And I remember that struggle well because I lived it, just to get the right to go to a decent school, the right to shop at a shopping center anytime that you wanted to go into a store anytime that you wanted to eat in a restaurant of your choice, to sleep in the hotel of your choice, or to take the public transportation of your choice. I remember that. So I think people have to know about those struggles. Young African Americans have to be reminded of the sacrifices made for them to get to even this point, as bad now as it may be. Maya Angelou made the statement once that every African American has been paid for. And I think she meant paid for by the blood and sacrifice of the ancestors that came before. This is the importance of quilts, to tell these stories.
Following our conversation, Dr. Mazloomi followed up with me, sharing a letter she had received from a visitor to And Still We Rise, the exhibit about civil rights history. I'd like to read an excerpt here. The viewer wrote, I recently saw an exhibition of the And Still We Rise quilts at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia, while visiting my daughter and her family. I was so touched, I felt I had to contact you and share my feelings about the exhibit. I was literally blown away by the beauty, ingenuity, artistic ability, and stories these quilts had to tell. As a white American, I was deeply embarrassed that I was so very ignorant of African American history and the huge part it has played in the history of our country. I'm ashamed that such a large and important part of our country's history has been left out of our education. I applaud the efforts of all of the artists and you for your job as curator of the exhibit. I shall take a cue from the quilts and try to retroactively educate myself on the legacy of what is an incredible part of the history of the United States. I asked Carolyn about the legacy of the Journey of Hope Quilts Inspired by President Barack Obama exhibit, particularly as we are in another presidential election year, one very different from 2008. With the United States in the midst of a pandemic and some of the largest protests against racism occurring since the 1960s.
In the spans of time since the Obama show and the Obama administration, we've taken strides back. I recall when President Obama was in office, he made an effort to pass laws to monitor the police and to stop military weapons and machinery going to police. And in this current administration, this president has rolled that back. So we've tumbled backwards. We can look at that show and look at those quilts and analyze those quilts and think about what's going on today and the difference. That's a historical study in itself.
Yeah, those quilts will certainly tell us a lot about that moment and that sense of optimism and hope many of us felt. And yeah, it's certainly discouraging.
But hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
Always, we as African Americans always look at the end of the tunnel and try and see the light. Otherwise, if we didn't see that light, we would not have survived these 400 years here. So always we think there's hope. There has to be hope.
In the conclusion to her 2009 interview, Carolyn Musgrave asked Dr. Mazloomi how she wants to be remembered.
How do you want to be remembered?
My legacy insofar as quilt making will be the founding of the Women of Color Quilters Network and recording the contributions of African American quilt makers to American quilt making, especially for the contemporary African American quilt maker. It's important for me that I do everything that I can to record their works, to exhibit their works, so that they have a place in quilt history.
The Quilt Alliance and the QSOS Oral History Project share Carolyn's drive to record the contributions of African American quilt makers. You can find links to her full interview from 2009, along with other interviews featured in this episode, images of her quilts and some of the Obama exhibit quilts, as well as details about Carolyn's books and exhibits on our episode page at quiltalliance.org/runningstitch. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Janneken Smucker. Join us next week for Running Stitch to hear from our guest, Ginny Beyer. Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast, is a project of the Quilt Alliance, a member-supported national nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing the stories of quilts and quilt makers. Running Stitch is hosted and written by me, Janneken Smucker, and I serve as co-producer with QSOS project manager Emma Parker, with support from Quilt Alliance Executive Director Amy Milne. This podcast is generously funded by the Robert and Artist James Foundation. QSOS oral history interviews are archived with our partners, the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and at the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. You can listen to full interviews and see photos of quilts at our website, qsos.quiltalliance.org. Running Stitch features music by Chris Eselgroth, accompanied by a singer featherweight, and Amy's Best Sewing Shears.